We got another crash out, man. This is crazy, man. We have to revisit a crash out, and we have legend, Hall of Famer Rebecca Lobo actually finally setting these ladies straight. You got.
So this ESPN host Elle Duncan said something absolutely wild about Caitlin Clark and WNBA fans, basically claiming that all these new supporters were draining the energy from the league. Fast forward to now, and the viewership numbers are in free fall while the WNBA stares down a potential lockout. Even Rebecca Lobo, who's a Hall of Famer, is out here telling players and media folks they messed up by driving fans away. Duncan's take didn't age well at all.
Against you. They see all the things the WNBA been doing, like giving y'all housing, paying for y'all babies, giving y'all cars, all types of stuff. Y'all are losing the people. Rebecca Lobo sets the record.
All right, let me be crystal clear about something. Do you think media people like Elle Duncan owe Caitlin Clark and her supporters an apology after how they were treated last season? Drop your thoughts below, because we seriously need to dive into one of the most cringe media disasters from the last WNBA season, and how it completely wrecked the credibility of everyone who was involved. Elle Duncan over at ESPN dropped some comments about Caitlin Clark and fresh WNBA fans that were so completely tone-deaf and disconnected from reality that people are still roasting her for it months later. Here's what went down. This all happened right when Caitlin Clark mania was at its absolute peak last season, and the WNBA was pulling in more eyeballs than it had ever seen in its entire existence. Arenas were packed, TV ratings were going through the stratosphere, and major networks were actually giving serious airtime to women's basketball coverage. This was literally everything the league had been desperately trying to achieve, and Elle Duncan picked that exact moment to hop on ESPN and declare that these new fans were draining the life right out of the WNBA. Not pumping life into it, not giving it energy, not rescuing it from irrelevance, but actively sucking the life out. Those were literally the words that came out of her mouth.
The truth. You are right. You are right, new fans. There has never been more viewership because of Caitlin Clark. There's never been more attention. They're doing 40 minutes on First Take about Caitlin Clark. They never did that before.
Hey, and you know what? And you know what they're not doing now, Elle Duncan? They're not doing 40 minutes on the WNBA when Caitlin Clark wasn't playing. They weren't doing 40 minutes on Colin Cowherd when Caitlin Clark was hurt and wasn't playing. They're not doing 40 minutes on Unrivaled on Nick Wright. First things first. They're not doing 40 minutes on Unrivaled with all these other stars y'all claim. Everybody's a star. The Paige Beckers, the big stars. Why ain't First Take talking about them?
Nobody seems to want to touch this topic, but let's examine just how completely insane that statement really was. The WNBA had been fighting for viewers and relevance for over 2 decades straight. You could barely catch games on national TV, and most arenas looked like ghost towns. Year after year, the league was hemorrhaging money, and only survived because the NBA was basically keeping it on life support, financially. That was the harsh reality before Caitlin Clark showed up on the scene. Then Clark gets her draft call, and everything flips overnight. Fever games start pulling massive television numbers. Every arena the Fever visits turns into a sellout crowd. ESPN and all the other networks suddenly start dedicating actual time to WNBA discussion during their programming. Merchandise is flying off the shelves. The whole economic foundation of the league starts shifting, because finally there's genuine fan engagement happening. And Elle Duncan's reaction to all this incredible positive momentum? The new fans are what's wrong. The new fans are sucking all the life out of the league. That might be the most backwards self-sabotaging opinion you could possibly express about your sport. Finally breaking through to mainstream success. But here's where it gets even worse. Because she wasn't operating in a vacuum with this mindset. There was this entire movement of WNBA players, media personalities, and longtime supporters who seemed genuinely frustrated that the sport was gaining popularity. They had beef with new fans for not understanding the league's complete history. They resented Caitlin Clark for being the catalyst that made people care. They actually resented success itself because it wasn't unfolding according to their preferred timeline or narrative. When somebody challenged Duncan during that same segment and brought up how viewership had never been higher thanks to Caitlin Clark, and how they were now doing 40-minute deep dives about women's basketball on First Take, when that never happened before, Duncan just waved it off completely. She acted like all that attention was somehow negative or came with too many conditions attached.
We talked about that earlier in our pod today. You actually were quoted somewhere saying this is the first time you have zero fear around the league folding, right? Which I totally know what you mean. It's like in other negotiations, there was always not like it was actually going to fold, but it was like, hey, we got to figure this out. How are we going to do this kind of a vibe? All right. So from your perspective, what should be like the high priorities for this agreement?
It's been interesting to kind of see how it has all evolved. And one of the things that strikes me is like the deal that, as you read it, that the owners have on the table for the players. And, I'm not privy to all of the information, but like, it looks like a pretty amazing deal. And that, like, if the players took the deal that's on the table right now, they should feel great about it because it's huge salaries. It is a degree of revenue sharing. It's going to allow the owners to continue to invest in the product. I mean, having a practice facility, having all the things that Sue and you played and I played all those years without. Like my New York Liberty team practiced.
Here's what she and others with similar attitudes completely missed. Sports media covers whatever people actually want to consume. First Take wasn't doing 40-minute breakdowns of the WNBA before Caitlin Clark showed up because virtually nobody was tuning in to watch WNBA games. That's not some kind of personal vendetta or bias issue. That's pure business economics. Television networks aren't going to burn prime airtime on content that generates zero ratings. But once Clark arrived and WNBA games started pulling legitimate viewer numbers, naturally, the media coverage expanded accordingly. This is exactly how it operates for every single sport on the planet. The NFL dominates coverage compared to the CFL because way more people watch NFL games. The NBA gets more attention than international leagues because the audience size is dramatically different. This really isn't rocket science here. Yet, Duncan and her allies acted like extensive Caitlin Clark coverage was somehow unfair to other players or actively harmful to the league's well-being. They wanted all the attention and coverage benefits without accepting that it was happening specifically because of one individual player's magnetic appeal. They wanted to enjoy the advantages of mainstream popularity while simultaneously rejecting the actual source of that popularity. Her comments about what compelling storylines supposedly existed in the WNBA before Clark are especially disconnected from reality. Duncan insisted there were other fascinating narratives happening. There was excitement and joy. There were discussions about competition and on-court action. But here's the thing that matters most. If those storylines were genuinely so captivating and engaging, then where exactly were all the viewers? Where was the extensive media coverage? Where were the packed arenas night after night? The truth is none of that existed, because whatever those storylines were, they simply weren't resonating with a broader mainstream audience. That's not meant to be disrespectful. That's just accepting the facts as they actually were. The WNBA absolutely had talented players and competitive games and memorable moments before Caitlin Clark entered the picture. What it didn't have was widespread public attention or basic financial sustainability. Now let's jump ahead to where we are today. The consequences of this hostile attitude toward new supporters are becoming painfully clear and undeniable. The WNBA is staring down a potential work stoppage because players and ownership can't reach agreement on a new collective bargaining deal. Viewership numbers for things like Unrivaled, that new 3-on-3 league, are absolutely cratering. Fans who got genuinely excited about women's basketball last season are starting to check out because they're exhausted from being labeled as racist or being told they're not welcome. That's exactly where Rebecca Lobo enters the conversation. Her recent comments are absolutely brutal for everyone who spent last season attacking Caitlin Clark and her fan base. Lobo is a Hall of Fame player with real credibility and deep history in women's basketball. Even she is now publicly stating that players need to be way more careful with their public statements because they're hemorrhaging public goodwill. Lobo explained that the current proposal from ownership is actually quite generous by any reasonable standard. Some salaries climbing over $1 million. Average salaries hitting around $500,000. Revenue sharing agreements and serious investment in facilities and infrastructure improvement. Looking at it objectively, that represents massive progress compared to previous deals and demonstrates real financial growth throughout the league. But instead of recognizing that advancement, certain players called the offer a slap in the face. They used aggressive confrontational language that immediately alienated fans who were genuinely trying to show support. Lobo specifically criticized that approach, emphasizing that players need to think much more carefully about how they communicate during these negotiations.
This is crazy, man. The WNBA players are single-handedly turning each and every fan. They're just pushing fans away. They're just pushing fans away. There's no.
She's being diplomatic in how she's putting it, but she's completely right about the situation. When you're earning hundreds of thousands or potentially over $1 million playing professional sports and you characterize that as getting slapped in the face, you're going to push away regular working people who earn normal paychecks at normal jobs. You're destroying the public support that's been absolutely critical to the league's recent surge in popularity. Lobo also brought up how players wore those "pay us what you owe us" shirts during the All-Star game and initially got tremendous fan backing. The crowd was completely behind them in that moment, but then the actual All-Star game itself was a complete embarrassment. The quality of play on the court was so bad that suddenly all that public support started evaporating because fans realized they were being asked to support players who weren't even giving full effort during their biggest showcase event of the year. Then there was the whole situation with Commissioner Kathy Engelbert getting booed for a solid minute in Las Vegas, and this was before Nafisa Collier made her controversial statements about racism. The fans were already turning against the league's leadership because of how they'd been treated and spoken about throughout the entire season. Lobo's point about public sentiment shifting from supporting players to actually siding with owners is really significant here. Typically during labor disputes, fans automatically side with players against billionaire ownership groups, but in this specific case, so many supporters have been insulted, dismissed, called racist, and told they're unwanted, that they're actually backing management instead. That shows you just how badly the players and their media allies have botched this whole situation.
There has never been more viewership because of Caitlin Clark. There's never been more attention. They're doing 40 minutes on First Take about Caitlin Clark. They never did that before.
Hey, and you know what? And you know what they're not doing now, Elle Duncan? They're not doing 40 minutes on the WNBA when Caitlin Clark wasn't playing. They weren't doing 40 minutes on Colin Cowherd when Caitlin Clark was hurt and wasn't playing. They're not doing 40 minutes on Unrivaled on Nick Wright. First things first. They're not doing 40 minutes on Unrivaled with all these other stars y'all claim. Everybody's a star. The Paige Beckers, the big stars. Why ain't First Take talking about them? Why ain't nobody talking about them?
All of this traces directly back to the exact attitude Elle Duncan was expressing in that original clip. This idea that new fans represented some kind of problem instead of being the obvious solution the league needed. The resentment directed at Caitlin Clark for being the reason the league was finally breaking through to mainstream audiences. The hostility aimed at people who simply wanted to watch quality basketball and show support for women's sports. Just think about how many people got genuinely excited about the WNBA last season, specifically because of Caitlin Clark. They purchased tickets and watched games religiously and bought jerseys and other merchandise. They were completely ready to become dedicated long-term supporters of the entire league. Instead of welcoming them with open arms, they got told they were racist. They got told they only cared about Clark because she happens to be white. They got told their support was conditional and therefore completely worthless. Who would possibly want to stick around after getting treated like that? Why would you continue supporting a league where players and media members openly hate the fact that you exist as a fan? Obviously, you wouldn't. Which explains why viewership is declining and public opinion has shifted so dramatically. The Unrivaled situation demonstrates this perfectly. That league was supposed to be this amazing alternative showcasing WNBA stars during the off-season break, but the television ratings have been absolutely disastrous. Games on TNT and True TV are pulling something like 32,000 viewers in certain time slots. That's genuinely embarrassing for a nationally televised sports product. And why are the numbers so terrible? Because Caitlin Clark isn't participating, and the fans who discovered women's basketball because of her have zero interest in watching Unrivaled. Those other stars that media personalities like Duncan claimed were equally important and equally deserving of attention can't generate an audience without Clark being involved. That's not meant as an insult to those players. It's simply acknowledging reality. Star power drives everything in professional sports, and Caitlin Clark possesses it while most other WNBA players, unfortunately, don't. Recognizing that fact isn't diminishing anyone else's abilities or contributions. It's just understanding what actually drives viewership numbers and revenue streams in professional athletics. Nafisa Collier claimed she was showing people how to properly run a business with Unrivaled. But TNT is reportedly considering backing out of their agreement because nobody's watching the games. That's not demonstrating business expertise. That's proving exactly why the WNBA desperately needed Caitlin Clark's star power to connect with mainstream audiences in the first place. The point about needing media training is absolutely perfect too. These players keep getting in front of cameras and microphones and saying things that actively damage their own interests and goals. They have no idea how to communicate with fans or media in ways that build support instead of completely destroying it. The consequences are becoming crystal clear at this point. Lobo talked about playing at Barclays Middle School on a middle school-sized court when she was with the Liberty. That's the kind of historical context current players seem to be completely missing. The league has made incredible progress in terms of facilities, salaries, and overall investment levels. But instead of acknowledging that advancement and pushing for continued improvement, some players act like they're being exploited when they're actually receiving treatment that previous generations could never have imagined. When fans started learning about all the additional benefits WNBA players receive, like housing allowances and childcare support and travel accommodations and other assistance, it completely changed how people viewed the situation. Everyone realized these players are actually being treated quite well relative to what the league actually generates in revenue. That made all the "pay us what you owe us" messaging seem way less convincing and compelling. The details emerging during these CBA negotiations have legitimately turned people away from supporting the players' position. When you discover that ownership is offering million-dollar maximum contracts and substantial revenue sharing for a league that still operates at a loss, it becomes really difficult to feel sympathy for players, calling that a slap in the face. Elle Duncan's original comments perfectly captured the mindset that's now seriously damaging the WNBA. The resentment toward fresh supporters, the hostility directed at Caitlin Clark, the refusal to acknowledge why the league was finally experiencing growth. All of that has completely backfired on everyone who was involved. The most frustrating part is this entire mess was completely preventable. If players and media personalities had simply welcomed new fans and celebrated Caitlin Clark's massive impact and focused on building momentum from last season's success, the WNBA would be in an absolutely incredible position right now. Instead, they're facing a potential work stoppage with declining public support because they couldn't stop getting in their own way. Elle Duncan said new fans were sucking the life out of the WNBA, and now the league can barely keep breathing because those same fans got pushed away. Rebecca Lobo is desperately trying to salvage the situation by calling for better communication strategies. But the damage has already been done. If you're sick of media nonsense like this, smash that like button and subscribe for more honest takes on what's really happening.